For most of your gardening life, you've been told the same thing about compost. That if you want the good stuff, the dark, crumbly, sweet-smelling kind, you have to earn it. Turn the pile, sweat over it, keep it hot, check it like a roast in the oven. And here is the quiet little secret that almost nobody says out loud. The gardeners who grew the richest soil this country has ever seen never did any of that. They never owned a thermometer. They never wrestled a steaming heap with a pitchfork on a Saturday morning. Some of them barely lifted a finger, and their soil was the better for it. So if turning that pile has started to feel like a chore your knees would rather skip, sit with me a minute. Because the very thing we were all taught to do may be the thing quietly undoing our best work. And what those old gardeners did instead was so simple, it almost feels like cheating. If you have spent years doing it the hard way, layering your greens and your browns just so, turning every few days, fussing over the heat, I want to say something to you first. None of that was wasted, and none of it was foolish. You were doing exactly what the books told you. The trouble is, the books were written to solve a problem that most of us, in our own backyards, simply do not have. The hot pile you were taught to build was designed for a working farm, for animal manure that might carry something you would not want near your lettuce, for burning off disease and weed seed where that truly matters. It was good advice for that job. But somewhere along the way, that one method quietly became the only method. It got printed in every gardening book, taught in every extension office, repeated until it sounded like the only honest way to make compost. And the part nobody ever mentioned is what all that heat costs you. We will get to that. But first, I want to take you back to the man who started it all, because his story is not the one you would expect. About 100 years ago, a British scientist named Sir Albert Howard went to India to teach modern farming. And the longer he stayed, the more he realized the farmers there had far less to learn from him than he had to learn from them. What he carried home gave us the compost pile we all know today, and what he could not have known is the very thing we are about to put right. At a research station in a place called Indore back in the 1920s, Howard watched how those farmers fed their land. Not with anything from a bag, but with patiently rotted plant matter and manure turned back into the earth season after season. And he came to believe something that still sits at the very heart of good gardening today. That the health of the soil, the plant, and the person eating the food were all one and the same thing. Indivisible, he called it. His ideas reached a young American named Rodale, who built a whole organic movement on them. The same Rodale name behind that old organic gardening magazine some of you grew up reading at the kitchen table. So Howard was no villain in this story. He was a hero of feeding the soil. But the science of what actually lives down there in the ground, that whole invisible little world, was still in its infancy when he did his work. And as his method traveled, it got simpler and louder until it boiled down to 4 words. Keep it hot. Turn it. And that is where the quiet trade-off begins. Let me tell you what really goes on inside a hot pile, in plain terms, the way I wish someone had told me years ago. When you build a big heap of fresh grass, kitchen scraps, and leaves, the first thing to wake up is bacteria. Billions of them, eating the soft, easy stuff. And they eat so fast and breathe so hard that the whole pile heats up, the same way a fresh stack of grass clippings will steam on a cool morning. Built right, that heap can climb past 130 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes up toward 160. And that heat does real work. It is fast. It kills off disease and weed seed. For a farm, that is a genuine gift. But here is what else that heat does. It burns out the fungi. And once you understand what those fungi were really doing, you will never look at a steaming pile the same way again. Now, I want to be careful here because this is the very spot where so many garden videos get it wrong. I am not talking about the famous root partner fungi, the mycorrhizae, the ones some of you have heard me talk about before. Those live tangled up inside living plant roots. They were never really living in your compost pile to begin with. The fungi I mean are the quiet decomposers, the ones that spin out fine white threads. You have seen them, that cobwebby, almost cottony webbing laced all through a pile of old leaves. Those threads are the real soil builders. They are slow, they are patient, and they are the only things in the whole pile strong enough to break down the tough, woody parts, the stems, the twigs, the veins of an autumn leaf, and turn them into the dark, spongy crumb that good soil is made of. And they cannot take the heat. Most of them give up well before a hot pile ever reaches its peak. So the very heat that makes it fast is the very heat that cooks out the one ingredient that would have made it last. What you are left with after all that turning is compost that feeds your plants for a few weeks, a quick meal, and then fades. It is not worthless. I want to be honest about that. It is real compost, and it will help your garden. But it is only half the story. The half that builds soil for years went up with the steam. Now I have to keep a promise I make to you in every video. To tell you the truth, even when the truth is less tidy than the story. For about 200 years, gardeners and scientists believed that all this slow rotting produced a magical, permanent substance called humus, one that locked carbon in the ground for hundreds, even thousands of years. But lately, soil scientists, including researchers at Cornell University, took a hard second look with modern tools. And what they found was humbler. Soil, it turns out, is more of a living, shifting, slowly changing thing than a treasure locked away in a vault. So I am not going to stand here and promise you that a pile of leaves will lock carbon away for 1,000 years. The honest scientists are still working that part out. But here is what that means for your beds, and what nobody is arguing about. Soil that is fed slowly by patient fungi and left undisturbed gets darker, crumblier. It holds water through a dry spell when bare dirt would have cracked wide open. It hangs on to its nutrients instead of letting the rain wash them away. You do not need a laboratory to prove that. You need a single season and a handful of your own soil. That, right there, is the difference between selling you a miracle and handing you the truth. There is one more helper in a cool pile that a hot pile never gets to meet: earthworms. A hot pile, by its very nature, is far too hot for them. No worm can survive those temperatures, and so a steaming heap does all of its work without a single one of them. But a cool pile, sitting quietly on bare earth, that becomes a 5-star resort for worms. They climb up out of the soil below, drawn by the moisture and the food and the steady, gentle warmth, and they get straight to work, eating, tunneling, mixing. You know, more than 140 years ago, in 1881, Charles Darwin, yes, that Darwin, published his very last book. And it was not about finches or faraway islands. It was about earthworms. He had spent 40 years watching them in his own garden, and his conclusion was this: that few creatures on this earth, he wrote, have done more to shape the very ground beneath our feet than the humble, lowly earthworm. He understood, long before anyone else, that worms are nature's plowmen, the ones that turn your pile for you so that you never have to. Now, you have probably heard it said that worm castings, that dark, crumbly stuff the worms leave behind, are 5 to 11 times richer in nutrients. That figure is real. It comes from the Extension Service at New Mexico State University. But let me give it to you straight, the way they actually meant it. That comparison is against the plain soil around the worm, not some magic the worm performs inside its little body. A worm does not manufacture nutrients out of thin air. What it does is gather them up and unlock them, turning what was already there into a form your plants can finally use, and leaving it right where the roots can reach. It is not magic. It is just patient, honest work. The kind nobody can ever sell you in a bottle. If all of this is starting to sound like old folklore to you, like something your grandmother might have known, but no university would ever admit, let me introduce you to a man who put it to the test. Dr. David Johnson is a scientist at New Mexico State University, and he and his wife and research partner, Hui-Chun Su, built something they call a bioreactor. Though, do not let the fancy word fool you. It is really just a tall pile of compost that you never, ever turn. That was the whole point. Johnson understood that every single time you plunge a fork in and flip a pile, you tear apart those fine fungal threads we just talked about. You cut them right when they are getting established, and you send the whole thing back to square one. So he simply stopped. He let his piles sit, undisturbed, for the better part of a year. And what he grew was a compost so rich in fungi that it works less like a fertilizer and more like a starter, the way a single spoonful of old sourdough wakes up a whole fresh loaf of bread. A little of it, spread on tired soil, brings the entire living world of that soil back to life. No turning, no bag, no bottle, just patience and a pile left alone. And that really is the whole method, which brings me to something I would like to put in your hands. I have taken everything we are talking about today, the simple steps, the short list of what to skip, and an honest, year-by-year picture of what building living soil really looks like. And I have gathered it all onto a single page. One page, plain enough to tape right inside your shed door or tuck into your gardening notebook. If you would like it, just point your phone at the code on your screen and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for, nothing to buy. Consider it a gift between gardeners. But before you wander off to fetch your phone, stay with me just a little longer. Because there is one mistake I have watched break the hearts of good, careful gardeners. A mistake that can quietly poison the garden bed for years. And the cruelest part of it is almost never the gardener's fault. Picture this. You did everything right. You brought home a load of compost, or a few bags of manure, or a bale of straw. Good, honest soil building material. You worked it into your beds. You planted your tomatoes, your beans, your peppers, the way you have 100 times before. And then, they came up wrong. Leaves curled and cupped and twisted as if the plants were in pain. Growth stunted, little fruit or none at all. And you stood there in your garden, going over it again and again in your mind, wondering what on earth you had done wrong. I want to tell you something. There is a very real chance you did nothing wrong at all. There is a family of weed killers with long, unfriendly names like aminopyrrolid and clopyrrolid that farmers spray on hayfields and pastures. And these particular chemicals are stubborn. They pass right through an animal that eats the treated hay, straight into its manure. They ride along through the entire composting process without breaking down. And they can linger in the soil for months, sometimes even for years. The Extension Service at Oregon State University has documented gardeners who lost nearly their whole vegetable crop this way. From bagged or trucked-in compost they had every reason in the world to trust. So, how do you protect yourself? Well, here is where this all comes full circle. The single safest compost you will ever use is the one you made yourself, from your own leaves and your own kitchen scraps. The pile in the corner of your yard owes nothing to a sprayed hayfield 3 counties over. It is free. It cannot be poisoned by something you never bought. And it can never, ever be sold back to you. There is a quiet kind of freedom in that. So let us walk through it together. How to make this compost from start to finish. And I will warn you now, it is so simple it barely deserves to be called a method. It is closer to a decision to leave well enough alone. First, the spot. Pick a corner of your yard in part shade, under a tree or along a fence, where the summer sun will not bake it bone dry. And this part matters. Set it right on the bare ground, not on concrete, not on a patio, not on landscape fabric. Because the worms and the fungi and all the good life of the soil need to be able to climb up into your pile from the earth below. You are simply giving them a doorway. Second, the building of it. And here, the rule is the gentlest in all of gardening. Pile it up. That is very nearly the whole of it. You want mostly browns, dry leaves, straw, a little shredded cardboard, with a smaller helping of greens mixed in, your grass clippings and your kitchen scraps. If your pile is all dry brown, it will rot ever so slowly. If it is all wet green, it will pack down into a sour, slimy mat and smell just terrible. A rough, easy mix is all you are ever after. And of all the materials you could possibly use, the humble fallen leaf is the quiet king of them. Free every single autumn, and the very thing the forest floor itself is built from. When you carry out a bowl of kitchen scraps, just tuck them under a few inches of those dry leaves. That takes you all of 30 seconds, and it keeps the flies and the rodents well away. That is not labor. That is a small, kind habit. Third, and this is the hardest part for those of us who like to feel useful. Walk away. Put the pitchfork back in the shed and leave it there. Every time you turn a cool pile, you shred those fungal threads and you start the whole clock over again. Do not stir it. Do not water it unless it has gone truly bone dry through a long drought. The rain will mostly tend to it for you. And please, do not buy a single one of those compost starters or activators in a bottle. The little workers you need are already there. They came in on every leaf and every scrap and up from the soil below. They do not need one thing you can purchase. Now, a few honest mistakes to steer well clear of so your good work is never wasted. Do not toss in weeds that have already gone to seed. A cool pile may not get hot enough to kill those seeds, and you will only be planting them right back in your beds come spring. The same goes for any plants that were sick with disease. And keep meat, dairy, and oily leftovers out of it. They turn rancid, and they call in every raccoon in the county. Keep it to leaves, scraps, and plant trimmings, and you simply will not go wrong. And then, fourth, you wait. A pile of leaves and garden trimmings will be ready in about 6 to 12 months. Add woody branches or wood chips, and it may take a year and a half, but that woody material makes the finest, longest-lasting soil of all, so it is patience very well spent. You will know it is ready when it is dark and crumbly, and it smells like the floor of a forest after rain, with no trace left of the leaves or the scraps you started with. And one last thing, the most important of all. When you spread it, lay it gently right on top of your beds. Do not dig it in. Do not till it under. Just a layer an inch or two deep on the surface, the very way the forest lays down its leaves. The rain will carry the goodness down to the roots. The worms will pull it under for you. You did the gathering. Now let the soil do the planting. Now, in the spirit of telling you the whole truth, let me be fair to that hot pile, because there are still times when it is exactly the right tool for the job. If you are composting animal manure, or plants that were sick with disease, or weeds heavy with seed, that is precisely when the heat earns its keep. The high temperature does the one thing a cool pile cannot promise. It sanitizes. It kills off what you would never want carried into your vegetable beds. And if you do find yourself in that spot, there is a lovely middle path that gives you the best of both worlds. Build your pile to run hot for just the first few days. Let it heat up and do its cleaning. And then stop. Stop turning it, walk away, and let it cool and sit for the rest of the year, just like any other quiet pile. The heat cleans it, the patience builds it, and you get safe compost and living compost both from one and the same heap. Let me be honest with you about what to expect, because I would never want you to feel that you had done something wrong. The first year, you may look at your beds and think that nothing much has happened at all. You will see the top inch or so begin to darken, and your soil will feel just a touch easier to push a trowel into. And that is all. And that is exactly right. It is by the second and the third year, once you have laid down a fresh layer each spring or fall, that the change becomes something you can truly feel in your hands. The soil turns crumbly and soft. It holds its moisture between the rains instead of cracking, and it darkens deeper year over year, the way a forest floor quietly builds itself downward across the seasons. You will not reach the deep, black soil of an old woodland in your lifetime. No one does. But every single year, you are building on the one before. The pile you start this autumn is a gift to the gardener you will be 3 springs from now. That slow patience is not the price of this method. It is the method. I told you right at the start about the gardeners who grew the richest soil and never once picked up a pitchfork. I think about them often. For years, and I will be honest with you, I did it the hard way. I turned and I fussed, and I poured good money into bags and bottles, certain that the harder I worked, the better my garden would have to be. It took me a long, long time to understand that I had it all backward, that I was never really meant to be feeding the plants at all. I was meant to be feeding the ground beneath them, and then getting out of the way and letting it do what it has done, all on its own, since long before any of us ever arrived. A pile of leaves in a quiet corner, a little rain, a little time, and the patient, invisible work of fungi and worms, asking nothing of you in return. If that is the kind of gardening you come from, or the kind you would like to grow into, then you already belong here. Come along with us, subscribe, and let's keep tending the soil the old, honest way. Together.